It seems like anytime there's some instances of real world violence that could be somewhat connected to video games, the media likes to jump on that opportunity to try to demonize games and people who play them. This time, though, it's not like they're trying to attack games that are legitimately violent games or have questionable messages within the games. No, they're going after Among Us of all games, and anyone who's familiar with Among Us would probably already be laughing about this because it's pretty ridiculous to try to say Among Us inspires real world violence, but they're not outright saying that, but they definitely are trying to imply it with this article. This one right here I have pulled up is actually from that Park Place. They're talking about NBC News because NBC News are the ones who are implying that video games are connected to real world violence. NBC News implies video game Among Us may have inspired United Healthcare CEO Assassin. Yes, that's right there. They're trying to say this inspired a real life assassination. And one of the more egregious narratives to come out of the 24-hour news cycle coverage of the assassination of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, NBC News attempted to create a connection between alleged assassin Luigi Mangione and the video game Among Us. Thompson was gunned down in the streets of New York City by a masked assailant on December 4th. After that, a manhunt erupted for the suspect that went on for longer than it probably should have. Luigi Mangione was arrested in a McDonald's parking lot 5 days later on December 9th. And then it goes into saying like he had this stuff on him, talking about how there's people within the media, or at least there was this bit on Jimmy Kimmel's show saying how a lot of his staff members actually like the guy and stuff like that, which to me, that's more of a reason or something to blame for stuff like this versus video games. But I will get more on that towards the end of this video. But this is kind of where they're getting their whole narrative from about how he played the game Among Us. And because we live in an era of the 24-hour news cycle, anchors needed to fill time and find things to talk about surrounding this high-profile story. That's what led NBC News to Alejandro Romero, a former college roommate of Mangione, who was once in the same Discord server as him. I just found it extremely ironic that, we were in a game and there could actually be a true killer among us, he said. As soon as his photo and name popped up on X, my friend texted me asking if I knew him, and then either I was calling some 10 friends and they were calling me, Romero said. I didn't speak to anybody today who wasn't already aware of what had happened. Romero noted that their group once played the game Among Us. In the game, one of the players is designated as a killer and saboteur. And just to kind of elaborate on that for people who aren't familiar with Among Us, which I'm sure if you're watching this video, you probably already know, but just in case there are people out there who've never played the game, the way it works is you have a group of people playing it at once, and then there's one or two people who is the assassin or saboteur. The job of everyone else is to try to find out who this person is while they're also completing tasks. The saboteur killer is trying to undermine what they're doing and take out people. And if they can take out enough people or cause enough damage to the place that they're at, well, then they win. But if they can find out who the killer is and fix all the stuff that's going wrong, well, then the other team wins. And that's essentially how it is. And it's not like this is even a particularly violent game. It's actually a game meant for kids. In fact, it has a ESRB rating of E+10, which is for parents out there, it's around a PG rating. Not necessarily the most tame thing, but not necessarily anything that people would consider extremely violent. I have some of the kill compilation. I got this video I just found, I pulled up. So just take a look at some of the kill animations that are in this game. So there, that's one right there. So this person snuck up on someone else and killed them. Then there's this other one right here. Okay, got that one. Maybe that's similar to the CEO assassination. But regardless of all that, this is pretty tame and cartoony by most modern video game standards. They're trying to say that this is, or at least imply that this is linked to the real world assassination. And like I was saying, I don't buy it, especially since the only connection is like, yeah, he played it in college. We don't know how often he played it, but even if he played it regularly, I don't think that's really that big of a deal considering how many people actually played this game. It's not the most popular game online, but it's still pretty popular amongst certain segments of gamers out there who play it regularly. And if this was linked to any real world violence, and I think there would be seeing a lot more of that. In fact, some of the more popular games out right now, like the Grand Theft Auto series, Call of Duty games, those are significantly more violent and actually rated mature. And people play those all the time. So I would think if video games could be related to real world violence, then you would see more of an uptick because of how popular those games are. But the fact of the matter is, the connections between video game playing and actually committing violence is dubious at best. So talking about how he played the game, that was all NBC News needed to hear, much as we've seen mainstream media outlets do in the past. The Peacock branded news outlet started to draw a parallel between violent video games and actual real-world violence. The article is titled "Extremely Ironic: Suspect in United Healthcare CEO Slaying Played a Video Game Killer, Friend Recalls." And while NBC News writer Alicia Victoria Lozano, doesn't outright say that Mangione was inspired to commit actual cold-blooded murder from a children's video game, she certainly implies it through the article. Luigi Mangione, who was arrested and charged with murder in the shooting death of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, once belonged to a group of Ivy League gamers who played assassins. A member of a group told NBC News, "Maybe you should try to examine the connection between someone committing real-world violence and someone who went to an Ivy League school, or at least people who have a penchant for violence going to Ivy League schools, because a lot of them become politicians. Politicians advocate for war and violence in the world. So maybe there's something that be examined there. We don't know." And to me, that's about as ridiculous as what they're trying to say here. It's like, you can always look at someone's past and say, they did this. Could this be connected to this violence in some way, shape, or form? Like, what media did this person consume? Did they ever watch NBC News? If that's the case, then what's the connection between the people who watch NBC News versus people advocating or committing real world violence? Like I said earlier on in the video, they're talking about how the staff members for Jimmy Kimmel were actually in favor of this person right there. And he had a whole segment about how a lot of his staff members really liked this guy because of what he did. I'm sure they probably consume NBC News. So maybe there is something to be drawn from there. What's the connection between the people at NBC News and people advocating for real world violence? Are they going to ever ask those questions? No, of course not. They're not going to look into that because that kind of destroys their whole narrative. They want to get rid of video games and gamers because, frankly, they don't like or respect video games and gamers, but also because that's a type of new media that's basically taking over the traditional media. A lot of people aren't paying attention to what they're doing. They're paying attention to gamers and people who stream video games, and they're listening to those type of people. So the media, they're trying to basically undermine their competition with this sort of smear they're doing right here. So where was that? Talking about the game Among Us. This reeks of the media blame cast on the world of gaming to justify the actions of mentally ill or deranged individual. Gaming always seems to get brought into the conversation when tragedy occurs. Games like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto, previously mentioned, series have been dragged through the mud by media outlets trying to make the case that somehow video games are radicalizing the youth of America. And there's been a number of studies done on this from the American Psychological Association, as well as many other universities out there. And like I was saying before, the connection is very dubious at best. The most that they've actually said is it could increase aggression in people who play video games and violent video games. But saying it increases aggression doesn't necessarily correlate to it increases violence. They say like that is very different, and being aggressive isn't necessarily a bad thing either. That's kind of a neutral thing. It's just a matter of what you actually focus on, and some people could turn that to violence, but a lot of those studies will even say it's like they don't know why some kids will choose to turn towards violence and while other ones don't. And even then, they don't know if they turn towards violence because they played the video games, or if they were drawn to the video games because they were already violent by nature, or there was some other factors and they just happened to play the video games. And that's why I'm saying it's pretty dumb to try to equate the playing of violent video games with actual real world violence right here. When asked about this, the developers of Among Us pretty much just kind of, I would say they just kind of laughed it off or just kind of dismissed it because the whole thing is pretty ridiculous. The developers of Among Us are taking it in comedic stride, though on Blue Sky, the Among Us account responded with the appropriately confused lowercase unpunctuated Meanwhile, the developer account for Innersloth calmly and civilly noted, interesting times we live in. As a capstone on this nonsense, Forrest Willard, co-founder of the studio, also wrote, as a CEO who made Among Us and nothing else, and appropriately fill in the blank joke because I didn't think anything's more absurd than Among Us, a game 10-year-olds can play, being cited as an assassin game in regards to a very real murder, allegedly motivated by very serious real-world issues. What else is there to say other than, and that's really it. There's a lot of reasons why a person will commit violent acts in real life, and to try to just almost dismiss it by saying it's the video games, that's the only reason. That's not really the way to get at the heart of the issue. It's basically just trying to, at best, it puts a band-aid on it. But even then, before video games were even conceived of, violence occurred in the world. So there's always going to be those type of people who are going to commit violent acts out there, and trying to say this is the sole reason why they do it. And you get this all the time too, where people say like, oh, well, it's also just the guns. You get rid of guns, you get rid of violence, or at least that's what they imply. You get rid of the video games, you get rid of violence. We've heard this kind of thing before, and that's not how it works. You have to get rid of the desire for people to commit violence, or you have to develop a moral principle for people to be opposed to violence. And so far, what we're seeing isn't people trying to address that issue. They're just trying to find something else to shift the blame to. And really, that's not going to help anything. And we've heard this, like I said, many times before. It's pretty much been debunked in academia, but still, media outlets are going to continue to push it. Meanwhile, people like myself are going to call them out on it and say that they're wrong for X, Y, and Z reasons. And some people are just going to laugh about it. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Do you think there's any connection to the playing of violent video games with actually committing real world violence? Or do you think it is just kind of a dumb thing and that I'm completely wrong on this one? Comment below, let me know. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to click that like button and share this video out there because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.